The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the Afghan mountains as Chief Petty Officer Sarah Ghost Martinez adjusted her scope for the third time. 300 Navy SEALs have been dropped into this godforsaken valley 12 hours ago, and something was already going terribly wrong. Sarah lay prone on a ridge overlooking the main valley, her Barrett M82 sniper rifle trained on the approaches below. The mission briefing had been clear: eliminate high-value targets in a Taliban compound, extract valuable intelligence, and get out clean. What they hadn't been told was that someone back at headquarters was about to abandon them all. "Ghost, this is Alpha Leader," crackled the voice of Lieutenant Commander Jake Bulldog Thompson in her earpiece. "We've got movement in the compound. Multiple heat signatures. Looks like more than intelligence suggested." Sarah swept her scope across the valley floor, where her fellow SEALs were positioned around the target building. Through her thermal imaging, she could see the telltale signatures of at least 50 hostiles moving through the compound, far more than the dozen they'd been told to expect. "Copy that, Alpha Leader. I count at least 50 tangos, possibly more moving in from the East Ridge," Sarah reported, her voice steady despite the growing concern in her gut. Something about this whole operation felt off from the start. The compound itself was a sprawling collection of mud brick buildings nestled in a valley that offered only one main route in and out. The SEALs had fast roped in from helicopters before dawn, but those same helicopters were supposed to return for extraction in 6 hours. That timeline was already looking optimistic. Sarah had been a Navy SEAL sniper for 8 years, one of only 12 women to ever complete the grueling training program. She'd earned her nickname Ghost during her second deployment, when she'd eliminated 17 enemy combatants in a single operation without anyone knowing she was there until it was all over. Her record was impeccable, her aim was legendary, and her instincts had kept her alive through 4 combat deployments. Those same instincts were screaming at her now. "Alpha Leader, I'm picking up radio chatter on Taliban frequencies," reported Petty Officer First Class Miguel Tech Rodriguez from his position with the communications equipment. "They're calling for reinforcements from 3 different locations. This isn't just a compound raid. It's turning into a major engagement." Lieutenant Commander Thompson's voice came back tense, but controlled. "How long before those reinforcements arrive?" "Best estimate, 2 to 3 hours for the closest group. Maybe 400 fighters total converging on our position." Sarah felt her blood run cold. 300 SEALs against 400 Taliban fighters wasn't impossible odds, but it would be a brutal fight. And that was assuming their extraction helicopters arrived on schedule and could land safely under fire. "Command, this is Alpha Leader requesting immediate priority extraction," Thompson radioed to the Tactical Operations Center back at Bagram Air Base. "Enemy strength significantly higher than intel suggested. We need those birds in the air now." The response that came back 15 minutes later would haunt every SEAL in that valley for the rest of their lives. "Alpha Leader, this is Command. Extraction is delayed indefinitely. Heavy weather moving in. Birds can't fly. Hold your position and complete the mission." Sarah lowered her eye from her scope and looked up at the clear blue sky above. There wasn't a cloud in sight. The weather station at Bagram was reporting perfect flying conditions. Someone was lying, and that lie was going to get all of them killed. "Sir, there's no weather," Tech Rodriguez whispered into his radio. "Satellite imagery shows clear skies for the next 48 hours. "I copy your transmission, Command," Thompson replied carefully, his voice betraying none of the fury Sarah knew he was feeling. "Requesting confirmation on weather conditions and extraction timeline." "Negative, Alpha Leader. Weather is the call. Hold position. Complete mission. Command out." The radio went dead, and Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. In 8 years of operations, she'd never been cut off from support like this. Someone had just signed death warrants for 300 of America's elite warriors. "Alpha Leader to all units." Thompson's voice cut through the silence. "Continue with primary objective. Stay sharp and stay ready." But Sarah was already calculating angles, distances, and ammunition counts in her head. Her elevated position gave her a commanding view of the entire valley and the approaches the Taliban reinforcements would have to use. When this became a fight for survival, she would be the only thing standing between her fellow SEALs and complete annihilation. She thought about the conversation she'd had with her younger brother Carlos just 2 weeks ago during their last video call. He was finishing his first year at MIT on a Navy scholarship she'd helped him get. "Why you keep going back, Sarah?" he'd asked her. "You've done enough tours. You could get a teaching job. Be safe." She'd smiled at him through the computer screen and said, "Because the people next to me in the field are counting on me to have their backs. That's what this job really is, making sure the person next to you gets to go home to their family." Now, lying on this ridge with her rifle and watching her teammates below, those words had never felt more true or more urgent. "Ghost, I need you to expand your observation arc," Thompson ordered. "I want early warning on any movement from all compass points. You're our eyes up there." "Copy that, Alpha Leader. I've got full valley coverage." Sarah began a systematic sweep of the surrounding terrain, cataloging every possible approach route, every piece of cover, every potential defensive position. If the Taliban were planning to surround them, she needed to see it coming. Through her scope, she watched the assault teams moving through the compound below. They moved with the fluid precision that came from years of training and combat experience. But even the best warriors in the world couldn't fight their way out of an impossible situation if their own command structure abandoned them. The first signs of the Taliban response came 90 minutes after the mysterious radio blackout from command. Sarah spotted the dust clouds first, vehicles moving fast along the eastern ridgeline. Then came the fighters on foot, flowing down the mountainsides like water, taking positions that would cut off every possible escape route. "Alpha Leader, I count approximately 200 fighters moving into position on the eastern approaches. They're not rushing in. They're setting up for a siege." "Copy that, Ghost. How long before they're in position?" Sarah studied the movement patterns through her scope. The Taliban fighters were moving with more discipline than usual, following what looked like a coordinated plan rather than just charging forward. Someone was commanding them, someone who understood military tactics. 30 minutes, maybe 45 before they have the eastern routes completely locked down, she reported. "After that, our only way out is going to be the western ridge, and that's a hell of a climb under fire." "Understood. All units, prepare for extended engagement. We're going to have to fight our way out of this one." But Sarah knew it was worse than Thompson was letting on. Fighting their way out would mean leaving the compound before completing their mission, and the intelligence they'd been sent to retrieve was apparently important enough that someone was willing to sacrifice 300 SEALs to get it. She keyed her radio on a different frequency, one reserved for emergency communications with the SEAL's own intelligence network. "Nightbird, this is Ghost. Emergency authentication Alpha 779er. A different voice came back, one she recognized as Master Chief Petty Officer David Oracle Kim, the SEAL's senior intelligence analyst. "Ghost, this is Nightbird. I copy your authentication. What's your situation?" "Nightbird, we've got 300 souls in hostile territory with command claiming weather delays on extraction. Visual confirmation shows clear skies and perfect flying conditions. Someone's lying to us." There was a long pause before Oracle's voice came back, and Sarah could hear the concern in it. "Ghost, I'm showing Operation Broken Arrow as classified above my pay grade 4 hours ago. I no longer have access to operational details or extraction protocols." Broken Arrow, the code name for their mission, being classified above Oracle's level meant someone very high up the chain of command had taken direct control. That usually only happened when operations went political or when someone needed plausible deniability for what was about to happen. "Copy that, Nightbird. Ghost out." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment and felt the weight of understanding settle on her shoulders. They hadn't just been sent on a difficult mission. They'd been sent to die. Someone had decided that whatever intelligence was in that compound was worth the lives of 300 Navy SEALs, and they'd arranged things so that no rescue would be coming. But they'd made one critical mistake in their calculations. They'd assumed that when the Taliban closed the trap, there would be no one left alive to tell the story of what really happened in this valley. They'd forgotten about the ghost on the ridge. Sarah opened her eyes and returned to her scope, beginning to plot firing solutions for the approaching enemy forces. If command had abandoned them, then it was up to her to make sure her teammates had a fighting chance to get home. She had enough ammunition for maybe 200 precise shots, and she'd need every one of them. The real fight was about to begin. 2 hours after the first Taliban reinforcements appeared on the ridgelines, Sarah had already fired 43 shots and eliminated 39 enemy fighters. Her position on the high ground gave her perfect sight lines into the valleys and approaches where the Taliban were trying to establish positions, but it also made her increasingly visible to enemy snipers who were now actively hunting for her. "Ghost, this is Alpha Leader," Thompson's voice crackled through her earpiece. "We've secured the primary objective and recovered the intelligence package. But we've got a problem down here." Sarah kept her eye pressed to her scope while she listened, tracking a group of Taliban fighters trying to work their way around the northern edge of the compound. At 800 meters, it was a challenging shot with the wind picking up, but well within her capabilities. "What's the problem, Alpha Leader?" she asked, then squeezed the trigger. The .50 caliber round found its target, and the lead Taliban fighter dropped instantly. The others scattered for cover. "The intelligence we recovered, it's not what we were told we'd find. This wasn't a Taliban safe house. It's a CIA black site, and the files we found show it's been operational for the past 6 months." Sarah felt her stomach drop. A CIA black site meant off-the-books operations, probably interrogations and intelligence gathering that couldn't be officially acknowledged. If the SEALs had just raided an American facility, that would explain why their extraction had been canceled and why the mission had suddenly been classified above Oracle's level. "Are you saying we just attacked our own people?" she asked, acquiring another target through her scope. "Negative. The site was already compromised when we arrived. All American personnel were gone, but the Taliban had been using it as a command center for the past week." "What's in these files?" "Ghost, if this information gets out, it's going to destroy a lot of careers and probably start a congressional investigation." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Someone had sent them to clean up a mess, and now that same someone was making sure there would be no witnesses to what they'd found. The SEALs weren't just being abandoned. They were being silenced. "Alpha Leader, how many personnel do we have wounded?" Sarah asked, knowing that the answer would determine their options for getting out. 17 wounded for critical. 2 Kia from the initial breach. Thompson's voice carried the weight of command responsibility. "Ghost, even if we could fight our way to the western ridge, we can't move the critical cases over that terrain. We need medical evacuation, or we're going to lose them." Sarah closed her eyes briefly. 23 casualties in the first 2 hours meant they were bleeding personnel faster than they could afford. The Taliban were content to keep them pinned down and let attrition do the work, knowing that reinforcements would eventually overwhelm the SEALs' position. "What about the emergency frequency?" she asked. "Can you raise any friendly assets in the area?" "Negative. Every call for assistance is being routed back through command, and command keeps giving us the same story about weather delays." Through her scope, Sarah could see more Taliban vehicles arriving from the south, trucks loaded with fighters and what looked like heavy machine guns. The enemy force was now easily over 300 strong and growing every hour. They were taking their time, setting up a perimeter that would be impossible to break through. Her radio crackled with a new voice, one she didn't recognize. "Unknown sniper on the northern ridge. This is Colonel Richardson, United States Army. Identify yourself immediately." Sarah frowned. There was no Colonel Richardson in their mission briefing, and no Army units were supposed to be in their operational area. She keyed her radio carefully. "Colonel Richardson, this is Chief Petty Officer Martinez, U.S. Navy SEALs. Request your authentication." "Chief Martinez, my authentication is classified. I'm ordering you to cease fire immediately and withdraw to grid coordinates 77 Alpha for immediate extraction." The coordinates he'd given would take her away from her overwatch position and away from the SEALs trapped in the compound below. It would also leave her teammates without sniper support at the moment they needed it most. Negative, Colonel. I have 300 SEALs under fire and requiring immediate support. I will not abandon my position. Chief Martinez, you are hereby ordered to disengage and withdraw. This is a direct order from Theater Command. Failure to comply will result in court-martial proceedings. Sarah felt anger flare in her chest. Someone was trying to pull her away from the fight, probably to eliminate the one person who could provide covering fire for an organized withdrawal. She switched to a secure frequency and keyed her radio. Alpha Leader, are you monitoring the command frequency? Roger, Ghost. I heard the whole thing. That's not any Colonel Richardson in our operational database. Copy that. Someone's trying to separate me from the team. Sarah acquired another target and fired, watching a Taliban machine gun team dive for cover as their gunner went down. Alpha Leader, what's your assessment of our tactical situation? There was a pause before Thompson responded, and Sarah could hear the sound of gunfire intensifying in the background. Ghost, I'm going to give it to you straight. We're surrounded, we're outnumbered 3-1, and those numbers are getting worse every hour. Without air support or artillery, our only chance is to break through their lines and reach the extraction point in the Western Hills. What about the wounded? We'd have to leave them. The critical cases can't make that movement. Sarah had been in Navy long enough to understand the calculus of combat. Sometimes impossible choices had to be made. But she'd also been a SEAL long enough to know that they never left anyone behind, ever. That was the code that separated them from every other military unit in the world. Alpha Leader, what if I could thin out their numbers? Give you a corridor to move the wounded. Ghost, you're one shooter against 300 fighters. Even you can't eliminate enough targets to change the tactical picture. But Sarah was already studying the enemy positions through her scope, calculating angles and possibilities. The Taliban had made one critical mistake. They'd assumed she was just providing standard Overwatch support. They hadn't realized she was planning to single-handedly break their siege. Alpha Leader, I need you to prepare for a coordinated movement in 2 hours. Have all teams ready to move on my signal. Ghost, what are you planning? Sarah was studying the ammunition she had left, 147 rounds of .50 caliber, plus her sidearm, and the explosives in her pack. It wasn't much against a force the size of what they were facing, but it might be enough if she used it right. I'm going to create chaos, she said simply. When I give the signal, you move fast, and you move everyone. No one gets left behind. Ghost, that's suicide. You can't take on their entire force by yourself. I'm not taking on their entire force, Alpha Leader. I'm just going to convince them that staying in this valley is more dangerous than letting us leave. Sarah began planning her movement route across the ridgeline. She'd have to relocate multiple times to avoid counter-sniper fire, and each new position would give her different angles on the enemy force below. If she could create the impression that there were multiple snipers working in coordination, she might be able to panic the Taliban fighters into abandoning their disciplined siege tactics. Alpha Leader, I need you to do something for me, she said, chambering another round and acquiring her next target. When you get back to base, I want you to make sure the real story of what happened here gets told. Not the official version, the truth. Ghost, you're talking like you're not coming back with us. Maybe I am, maybe I'm not. But someone needs to know that command abandoned us, and someone needs to know why. She fired again, and another Taliban fighter went down. The files you recovered from that black site, make sure they see daylight. The American people have a right to know what's being done in their name. Through her scope, she could see Taliban commanders moving among their fighters, probably preparing for the final assault on the compound. They knew the SEALs were running low on ammunition and options, and they were getting ready to finish the job. What they didn't know was that the Ghost on the ridge was about to become their worst nightmare. All units, this is Ghost. Sarah keyed her radio to the team frequency. In 1 hour and 45 minutes, I'm going to light up this valley like the 4th of July. When I give the signal, I want every team moving fast toward the western ridge. We're all going home today. She could hear acknowledgments coming back from team leaders throughout the compound, and for the first time since the mission began, There was something other than resignation in their voices. There was hope. Sarah began her preparation routine, checking and rechecking her equipment, planning her firing positions, calculating ammunition expenditure rates. She'd been trained for situations like this, though she'd never expected to face one where her own command structure was the enemy. In 45 minutes, she was going to start the longest and most important shooting session of her life. At exactly 1,347 hours, Sarah Martinez began what would later be called the most devastating one-person assault in modern military history. She'd spent the previous 90 minutes moving between 3 different firing positions along the northern ridge, pre-positioning ammunition, and mapping out every Taliban position in the valley below. Her first shot eliminated the Taliban commander who'd been coordinating the siege from a position near the compound's eastern wall. At 1,200 meters through a crosswind, it was a shot that announced to every fighter in the valley that death had arrived from above. Before the echo of that first shot had faded, Sarah was already moving to her second position, 200 meters west along the ridge. She'd learned long ago that the key to surviving as a sniper wasn't just accurate shooting. It was making sure the enemy could never predict where the next shot would come from. Her second shot took out the machine gun team that had been pinning down Bravo team for the past 3 hours. The .50 caliber round went through the gun's shield and eliminated both the gunner and his loader in a single shot. Bravo team immediately began suppressing the position with rifle fire, adding to the confusion Sarah was trying to create. "Ghost, this is Alpha Leader." Thompson's voice came through her earpiece. "Outstanding shooting. Taliban forces are starting to move." "Copy that, Alpha Leader. Phase 1 complete. Beginning Phase 2. Sarah shouldered her rifle and began moving to her third position, a rocky outcrop that would give her perfect sight lines into the Taliban's main staging area. She'd observed earlier that they were keeping their reserve forces and ammunition supplies in a cluster of vehicles about 800 meters south of the compound. But as she crested the ridgeline, Sarah found herself looking down the barrel of an AK-47 held by a Taliban fighter who'd somehow managed to climb up behind her position. Time slowed to a crawl as her training took over. Without thinking, Sarah dropped her rifle and drew her sidearm in one fluid motion, putting 2 rounds center mass into the enemy fighter before he could pull his trigger. The man dropped instantly, but his AK-47 clattered against the rocks as it fell, creating noise that would alert other nearby Taliban positions to her location. "Shit," Sarah muttered, grabbing her rifle and sprinting toward her third firing position. She could already hear voices calling out in Pashto from multiple directions. They'd figured out that there was at least one sniper on the ridgeline, and they were starting to hunt for her. She reached her third position just as automatic weapons fire began raking the rocks where she'd been 60 seconds earlier. The Taliban were good. They'd identified her general area quickly and were beginning a coordinated search. But they made the mistake of assuming they were hunting for a standard military sniper who would follow conventional tactics. Sarah wasn't conventional, and this wasn't a standard mission anymore. Instead of taking the careful, methodical shots that doctrine called for, Sarah began rapid-fire engagements against multiple targets. Her first shot destroyed the fuel tank of a Taliban truck, creating a massive fireball that sent burning fuel across the staging area. The explosion killed 6 fighters instantly and wounded a dozen more. Her second shot hit an ammunition crate in the back of another truck. The secondary explosion was even larger than the first, sending shock waves across the valley and raining debris down on Taliban positions throughout the area. "Jesus Christ, Gości." Thompson's voice was full of amazement. "What the hell are you shooting over there?" "Target-rich environment. Alpha Leader," Sarah replied, already acquiring her next target. Beginning selective elimination of command personnel. Through her scope, she could see Taliban commanders trying to restore order to their forces. The explosions had shattered their disciplined siege formation, and fighters were running in multiple directions, some trying to take cover from the sniper fire, others trying to advance on the compound while their enemies were distracted. Sarah began picking off the commanders with systematic precision. A shot to the head of a man with binoculars who was trying to coordinate an assault on the compound's southern wall. Another shot to eliminate a fighter who was using a radio to call for additional reinforcements. A third shot to take out what looked like a foreign advisor who was trying to rally a group of Taliban fighters who'd begun to retreat. Each shot was fired from a slightly different position as Sarah moved constantly along the ridge, never staying in the same place for more than 30 seconds. She'd fire 2 or 3 rounds, then sprint 50 meters to a new position and acquire new targets. The Taliban fighters below couldn't tell if they were being engaged by one sniper or an entire platoon. All units, this is Alpha Leader. Thompson's voice came over the radio. Taliban forces are beginning to withdraw from the eastern perimeter. Prepare for movement on Ghost's signal. But Sarah was already spotting a new problem. Through her scope, she could see fresh vehicles approaching from the north, reinforcements that would restore the Taliban's numerical advantage and trap the SEALs in the compound, even if she managed to break the current siege. Alpha Leader, I count approximately 50 additional hostiles approaching from the north. 2 trucks with mounted weapons. Copy that, Ghost. Can you interdict? Sarah studied the approaching vehicles through her scope. They were still over a mile away, moving along a mountain road that switched back down into the valley. At that range, and with the vehicles moving, it would be an extremely difficult shot, even under perfect conditions. But the conditions weren't perfect. The wind was gusting unpredictably. The afternoon heat was creating thermal distortions that affected her scope's clarity, and she was running low on ammunition after the sustained engagement of the past hour. Alpha Leader, I need you to be ready to move in 15 minutes, whether I stop those reinforcements or not, Sarah said, settling into a prone position and beginning to calculate the ballistics for the longest shots of her career. Ghost, that's not enough time to move the wounded. We need at least 30 minutes. Alpha Leader, in 30 minutes, those reinforcements will be in position, and we'll be back where we started, except with less ammunition and more casualties. Sarah chambered around and focused her scope on the lead vehicle, which was still 1,400 meters away and moving. I can give you 15 minutes of chaos, but after that, you're on your own. Understood, Ghost. All teams prepare for emergency movement in 14 minutes. Sarah took a deep breath and focused everything she'd learned in 8 years of combat into calculating the most important shot of her life. The lead truck was mounting what looked like a .50 caliber machine gun that would devastate the SEALs if it reached an effective firing position. She had to stop it before it got there. Wind speed, 8 knots from the southwest. Target speed, approximately 40 kilometers per hour. Range, 1,387 meters, and closing. Drop compensation, 12 clicks up. Windage, for clicks right. Sarah squeezed the trigger just as the truck disappeared behind a rock formation on the mountain road. For 30 seconds, she couldn't tell if her shot had found its target. Then, the truck reappeared around the bend, smoke pouring from its engine compartment, moving much slower than before. Her second shot, fired 15 seconds later when the truck came around another bend, found the fuel tank. The explosion lit up the mountain road and sent the burning vehicle rolling down the hillside, taking out a section of the road and blocking the route for the vehicle behind it. Outstanding shooting, Ghost. Thompson's voice was full of admiration. The second truck is backing away. You've bought us our window. But Sarah barely heard the praise. She was already moving to her final firing position, a rocky overhang that would give her clear sight lines to cover the SEALs' withdrawal route. She had maybe 60 rounds of ammunition left, and she was going to need every one of them to keep the Taliban forces suppressed while 300 SEALs moved through the valley below. All units, this is Alpha Leader. Thompson's voice echoed across the valley. Move, move, move. Emergency extraction to the western ridge. Ghost, we're moving. Sarah settled into her final position and began providing covering fire as her teammates started their desperate race across the valley floor. Taliban fighters were emerging from cover throughout the compound area, trying to re-engage the withdrawing SEALs, and Sarah methodically eliminated them one by one. Shot after shot rang out from her position as she covered the withdrawal. A Taliban fighter trying to flank Charlie team from the north. Another fighter setting up an RPG to target the main group. a sniper who'd gotten into position on the opposite ridge and was targeting the wounded being carried by their teammates. "Ghost, this is Bravo Leader," came a new voice on the radio. "We've got wounded falling behind. Taliban forces are starting to pursue." Sarah swung her scope toward the rear of the withdrawal route and saw what Bravo Leader was talking about. Four SEALs carrying stretchers with the most critically wounded were struggling to keep up with the main force, and a group of about 20 Taliban fighters was closing in on them from the east. The range was over 900 meters through difficult terrain with multiple obstacles between her and the targets. It would require shooting between and around rocks, trees, and other cover while the targets were moving. It was the kind of shooting that was theoretically possible, but practically impossible. Sarah took the shots anyway. In the span of 90 seconds, she eliminated 8 Taliban fighters and wounded 6 more, buying enough time for the stretcher teams to reach the cover of a rocky outcrop where other SEALs could provide support. It was shooting that defied everything she'd been taught about practical limitations and effective range. "How the hell are you making those shots, Ghost?" Thompson asked as the main force began climbing toward the western ridge. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, chambering what she realized was one of her last rounds. "I've never shot like this in my life." What she didn't say was that she felt something she'd never experienced before, a complete clarity of purpose that seemed to guide every movement, every breath, every squeeze of the trigger. It was as if every shot she'd ever fired, every hour she'd spent training, every lesson she'd learned about wind and distance and ballistics had all been preparation for this moment. She was no longer just Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez. She was the ghost on the ridge, and she was bringing 300 of America's finest warriors home. With only 17 rounds remaining in her ammunition supply, Sarah watched through her scope as the last group of SEALs began the treacherous climb up the western ridge toward the extraction point. They were making good time, but the Taliban forces were regrouping faster than she'd hoped, and new vehicles were arriving from multiple directions despite her successful interdiction of the northern reinforcements. "Ghost, this is Alpha Leader." Thompson's voice came through her earpiece, slightly breathless from the climb. "We're approaching the ridge line, but we've got a problem. I can see the extraction point from here, and there are no helicopters. The LZ is empty." Sarah felt her stomach clench. Even after everything they'd been through, even after the obvious betrayal by their own command structure, part of her had hoped that helicopters would be waiting when they reached the extraction point. The reality was worse than she'd feared. "Alpha Leader, have you attempted radio contact with extraction assets?" "Affirmative, Ghost." No response on any frequency. Either they're not coming, or they're maintaining radio silence because they've been ordered not to acknowledge us. Sarah swung her scope toward the extraction LZ, a flat area on the ridge that was large enough for several helicopters to land simultaneously. Thompson was right. It was completely empty. There were no aircraft, no ground support vehicles, no sign that anyone was planning to pull them out of the situation. "Alpha Leader, how much ammunition do the teams have remaining?" There was a pause before Thompson responded, and Sarah could hear him checking with his team leaders. "Ghost, we're running at about 30% of combat load across all units. Maybe 45 minutes of sustained fighting, less if we run into organized resistance. 45 minutes of ammunition against a force that was growing larger by the hour." Sarah calculated quickly. At current consumption rates, they'd be down to sidearms and hand-to-hand combat long before they could reach any friendly territory on foot. "Alpha Leader, what's the distance to the nearest known friendly base?" "Approximately 40 kilometers through hostile territory to FOB Mitchell. That's assuming Mitchell hasn't been compromised or abandoned like our extraction." 40 kilometers was a 2-day march under ideal conditions with fresh troops. With wounded personnel and depleted ammunition supplies, it would be impossible. The Taliban would run them down long before they reached safety. Through her scope, Sarah could see Taliban vehicles beginning to mass at the base of the western ridge. They'd figured out where the SEALs were heading, and they were preparing to cut off the escape route. In maybe 20 minutes, the ridge would be surrounded just like the compound had been. "Ghost, this is Charlie Leader," came a new voice on the radio. I've got eyes on Taliban forces moving up the backside of the ridge. They're trying to get above us and cut off our movement. Sarah swung her scope toward the area Charlie leader had indicated and confirmed the sighting. About 30 Taliban fighters were working their way up a goat path that would bring them out on the ridge behind the SEALs' current position. If they reached the high ground, they'd be able to fire down on the entire SEAL force with devastating effect. Charlie leader, how long before they reach the ridge line? Maybe 15 minutes if they maintain current pace. Sarah studied the terrain through her scope. The goat path the Taliban were using was narrow and exposed, with no cover for most of its length. It was a target-rich environment for a sniper, but eliminating 30 fighters with only 17 rounds would be mathematically impossible, even if every shot was perfect. Unless she could find a way to make the terrain work for her. Alpha leader, I need all teams to continue climbing toward the extraction point, but be prepared to take cover in approximately 10 minutes. Copy that, Ghost. What are you planning? Sarah was studying a rock formation about halfway up the goat path where several large boulders were balanced precariously on a narrow ledge. If she could destabilize those rocks at the right moment, when the Taliban fighters were directly below, she might be able to eliminate multiple targets with a single shot. Physics experiment, she replied, settling into a firing position and calculating the angle she'd need to hit the base of the largest boulder. The shot she was planning was unlike anything she'd ever attempted. Instead of aiming at human targets, she was trying to hit a specific point on a rock formation that would create a landslide. The variables were almost impossible to calculate. She didn't know the exact composition of the rocks, how much force would be needed to dislodge them, or whether the timing would work out to catch the Taliban fighters in the right position. But it was their only chance. Charlie leader, give me a countdown on the Taliban position, Sarah requested, settling her crosshairs on the base of the largest boulder. Ghost, lead elements are approaching the boulder field now. Main group is about 50 meters behind them. Sarah took a deep breath and waited. Through her scope, she could see the Taliban fighters moving in single file up the narrow path, their attention focused on the climb rather than on the ridge line above. They had no idea they were being watched by a sniper who was about to attempt something that violated every principle of conventional marksmanship. Contact in 30 seconds, Charlie leader reported. Sarah adjusted her aim slightly, focusing on a crack in the rock that looked like a stress point. She'd fired thousands of rounds in training and combat, but she'd never tried to start an avalanche before. Contact in 15 seconds. The Taliban fighters were directly below the boulder field now, bunched together on a narrow path with nowhere to go if the rocks above them started to fall. Contact in 5 seconds. Sarah squeezed the trigger. The .50 caliber round struck the boulder exactly where she'd aimed, and for a moment nothing happened. Then, with a grinding sound that echoed across the valley, the massive rock shifted and began to roll. It struck the boulder below it, which struck another, and suddenly the entire face of the cliff was coming apart. The landslide lasted almost 30 seconds, filling the air with dust and the sound of crushing stone. When it finally stopped, the goat path had been completely obliterated, and there was no sign of movement from any of the Taliban fighters who'd been climbing it. Jesus Christ, Gości. Charlie leader's voice was full of amazement. I don't know what you just did, but you eliminated the entire flanking force with one shot. 16 rounds remaining, Sarah said quietly, already looking for the next threat. She didn't have to look long. The main Taliban force at the base of the ridge had witnessed the landslide, and they were now beginning an all-out assault up the western slope. They'd abandoned any pretense of tactical patience, and were coming straight up the mountain in a human wave attack that would overwhelm the SEALs through sheer numbers. All units, this is Alpha Leader, Thompson's voice carried across the radio. Taliban forces are beginning final assault. All teams establish defensive positions immediately. This is our last stand. Sarah could see her teammates, through her scope, taking up positions among the rocks and sparse vegetation of the ridgeline. They were outnumbered at least 4-1, low on ammunition, and completely cut off from support. In conventional military terms, their situation was hopeless. But Sarah had stopped thinking in conventional terms hours ago. Alpha Leader, I need you to concentrate all remaining personnel in the center of the ridge line, she said, beginning to move to her final firing position. I'm going to try to funnel the Taliban assault into specific approach routes where you can concentrate your fire. Ghost, there are too many of them. Even if you channel their advance, we don't have enough ammunition to stop a force that size. Alpha Leader, trust me on this one. Consolidate your teams and wait for my signal. Sarah reached her final position, a rocky outcrop that gave her commanding views of the entire western slope. Below her, she could see the Taliban assault beginning in earnest. Hundreds of fighters moving up the mountain in multiple waves, their weapons firing constantly to suppress the SEALs' defensive positions. With 16 rounds remaining, she was about to attempt something that was tactically impossible. She was going to stop an entire army with a single rifle. But as she settled into her final firing position and began acquiring targets, Sarah realized something that filled her with calm determination. She wasn't trying to kill every Taliban fighter on the mountain. She was trying to save every SEAL on the ridge. And that was something she knew how to do. Sarah's first shot from her final position eliminated the Taliban commander, leading the assault up the western slope. A precise headshot at 800 meters that sent the advancing fighters diving for cover and disrupted their coordinated advance. But even as his body fell, other leaders emerged to take his place, and the human wave attack continued up the mountain. 15 rounds remaining. Her second shot destroyed a radio antenna being carried by a Taliban communications specialist, cutting off their ability to coordinate with forces approaching from other directions. The fighters were now operating on visual signals and shouted commands, which would slow their advance and create confusion in their ranks. 14 rounds remaining. Through her scope, Sarah could see her fellow SEALs taking up defensive positions along the ridge line, making every round count as Taliban fighters moved from cover to cover up the slope below. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed constantly across the mountains, punctuated by the occasional explosion of a grenade or the sharp crack of a sniper rifle. But Sarah wasn't just shooting to eliminate targets anymore. She was shooting to create psychological pressure that would break the Taliban assault before it could reach the SEALs' defensive line. Her third shot took out a fighter who was carrying an RPG toward a position where he could target the SEAL defensive line. The fourth shot eliminated a machine gun team that was providing covering fire for the advancing infantry. The fifth shot destroyed a mortar team that was setting up to provide indirect fire support. Each shot was perfectly placed to create maximum psychological impact. Sarah was systematically eliminating the Taliban's most dangerous weapons and their most experienced fighters, making every shot count for far more than just one casualty. 11 rounds remaining. Ghost, this is Alpha Leader. Thompson's voice came through her earpiece. Outstanding shooting. Taliban advance is slowing. But we've got new problems incoming from the east. Sarah swung her scope toward the eastern approach and saw what Thompson was talking about. Fresh Taliban reinforcements were arriving by vehicle and beginning to climb toward the ridge from that direction. The SEALs were about to be attacked from two sides simultaneously. Alpha Leader, how many personnel can you spare for Eastern defense? Maybe 20 shooters. Everyone else is committed to the western slope. 20 SEALs against what looked like 60 to 80 Taliban fighters climbing up the eastern approach. Those were impossible odds, even with superior training and equipment. Alpha Leader, keep all your personnel focused on the western assault. I'll handle the eastern approach. Ghost, you can't engage targets on both sides of the ridge simultaneously. The angles are all wrong from your position. But Sarah was already moving, sprinting along the ridge line toward a position that would give her sight lines to the eastern slope. She'd have to abandon her overwatch of the western assault, but if the Taliban broke through on the eastern side, it wouldn't matter how well the SEALs were doing against the western attack. 10 rounds remaining, and she was about to engage 80 enemy fighters with no backup and no support. As she reached her new position, Sarah could see the Eastern Assault Group moving up a rocky ravine that provided good cover from direct fire. They were moving with discipline and coordination, probably led by experienced fighters who understood mountain warfare tactics. But they'd made one critical mistake. The ravine they were using funneled them into a narrow bottleneck about 600 meters from Sarah's position, a kill zone where a single sniper could engage multiple targets with devastating effect. Her sixth shot hit a large rock formation above the ravine, triggering a small avalanche that blocked the route and forced the Taliban fighters to bunch up in the narrow space below. Her seventh shot eliminated the lead fighter who was trying to find an alternate route around the rockfall. 9 rounds remaining. The Taliban fighters in the ravine were now trapped between the rockfall above and their advancing comrades below. They were packed together in a space no larger than a basketball court, unable to spread out or take effective cover. Sarah began firing into the mass of targets with methodical precision, each shot eliminating multiple fighters as the .50 caliber rounds overpenetrated and struck additional targets behind the primary ones. In the span of 90 seconds, she fired 7 rounds and eliminated 23 enemy fighters. 2 rounds remaining. The eastern assault had been completely shattered, with the surviving Taliban fighters retreating back down the slope in disorder. But as Sarah swung her scope back toward the western approach, she could see that the main assault was still advancing toward the SEALs' defensive line. Alpha Leader, eastern approach neutralized, she reported. What's your status on the western slope? Ghost, they're getting close. Maybe 200 meters from our line. We're running low on ammunition, and there's still too many of them. Sarah studied the western assault through her scope. The Taliban fighters had reached a series of rock formations that provided excellent cover and concealment, allowing them to advance within effective range of the SEAL positions. In maybe 10 minutes, they'd be close enough to overrun the defensive line through sheer numbers. With 2 rounds remaining, Sarah couldn't eliminate enough targets to stop the assault, but she might be able to create one final psychological shock that would break their will to continue the attack. She'd spotted something earlier that she'd filed away for emergency use, a fuel truck that the Taliban had driven partway up the western slope to support their assault. It was positioned behind their main force, probably loaded with enough gasoline and ammunition to sustain their attack for hours. At 900 meters through challenging terrain, hitting a specific target on a vehicle would normally be an extremely difficult shot. But Sarah had stopped thinking about normal limitations hours ago. Her first shot punched through the fuel truck's tank, sending gasoline streaming down the hillside toward the Taliban positions. Her second and final shot struck a piece of metal near the truck's exhaust system, creating the spark she needed. The explosion was spectacular. The fuel truck detonated with enough force to be heard in the next valley, sending a mushroom cloud of black smoke hundreds of feet into the air. The blast wave knocked Taliban fighters off their feet and set fire to the vegetation across a wide area of the western slope. But, more importantly, it created the impression that the SEALs had artillery support. All stations, Sarah keyed her radio to broadcast on Taliban frequencies, speaking in the Pashto she'd learned during her previous deployments. This is American artillery control. We have your position marked, and more fire missions incoming. Withdraw immediately or be destroyed. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. Taliban fighters throughout the western assault began retreating down the slope, convinced that they were about to be targeted by American artillery strikes. Their disciplined assault collapsed into a disorganized rout as fighters abandoned their positions and fled toward the valley floor. Ghost, this is Alpha Leader. Thompson's voice carried a tone of amazement. I don't know what he just told them, but they're running. The entire western assault is withdrawing. Sarah watched through her empty rifle scope as the Taliban forces streamed down the mountainside in complete disorder. The siege was broken, the assault had failed, and 300 Navy SEALs were still alive on the western ridge. But the victory was temporary. Eventually, the Taliban would regroup and realize they'd been deceived. Eventually, they'd return in even greater numbers. Without extraction helicopters and without ammunition, the SEALs were still trapped in hostile territory with no way home. Alpha Leader, this is Ghost, Sarah said, beginning the long climb down from her sniper position toward the main force. We need to move now while they're disorganized. How long to reach friendly territory on foot? 40 kilometers through mountain terrain. Maybe 18 hours if we push hard and don't run into resistance. 18 hours was a lifetime in hostile territory, but it was their only option. The helicopters weren't coming, their ammunition was depleted, and sooner or later the Taliban would figure out that there was no artillery support targeting their positions. Alpha Leader, recommend we begin movement immediately. Every minute we stay here increases the chance they'll regroup and cut off our escape routes. But as the SEALs began preparing for the long march to safety, Sarah's radio crackled with an unexpected transmission. Ghost, this is Archangel 6. We are inbound to your position with extraction assets. ETA, 15 minutes. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. Archangel was the call sign for the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Army's elite helicopter unit that specialized in high-risk extractions. But, according to command, weather conditions made helicopter operations impossible. Archangel 6, this is Ghost. Confirm you're inbound for extraction. We were told helicopters could not fly due to weather conditions. Ghost, weather is clear and visibility is unlimited. We've been monitoring your frequency and decided to come get you without official clearance. Command can court-martial us later. Sarah closed her eyes and felt tears of relief running down her cheeks. Someone had decided that 300 Navy SEALs were worth more than military careers and official protocols. Someone had chosen to do the right thing regardless of the consequences. All units, this is Alpha Leader. Thompson's voice echoed across the ridge. Extraction helicopters inbound. Prepare for immediate evacuation. 20 minutes later, as Sarah climbed aboard the last helicopter to leave the ridge, she looked back at the valley where they'd spent the longest day of their lives. Smoke was still rising from the burning Taliban vehicles and equipment she destroyed during her one-person war against an entire army. The pilot, a chief warrant officer with 20 years of combat flying experience, turned to her as they lifted off. Ghost, I've been flying special operations missions for 2 decades, and I've never seen anything like what you did down there. How many rounds did you fire? 203, Sarah replied, settling back in her seat as the mountains fell away below them. And how many targets did you eliminate? Sarah thought about all the enemy fighters who wouldn't be going home to their families, all the Taliban commanders who would never plan another attack, all the vehicles and equipment that would never again threaten American forces. But mostly she thought about the 300 SEALs who were flying home with her. Enough, she said quietly. I eliminated enough. As the helicopter carried them towards safety, Sarah pulled out her radio one final time and switched to the emergency frequency that connected directly to SEAL Command at Coronado. Coronado Base, this is Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez. Authentication Alpha 779er. I have after-action intelligence that requires immediate attention from the highest levels of command. The response came back immediately. Ghost, this is Admiral Reynolds. We've been monitoring your situation. What intelligence do you have? Sir, someone in our chain of command deliberately abandoned 300 SEALs in hostile territory. We have recovered classified documents that suggest this was done to prevent exposure of unauthorized CIA operations. I request a full investigation and protection for all personnel involved in Operation Broken Arrow. There was a long pause before Admiral Reynolds responded. Ghost, you and your team are hereby placed under protective custody pending a complete investigation. Well done, Chief. Bring everyone home. Sarah closed her eyes and listened to the steady rhythm of the helicopter rotors carrying them towards safety. She'd kept her promise. Every SEAL was coming home. But, more importantly, she'd made sure that the truth about what happened in that valley would see daylight. The Ghost on the Ridge had won more than just a battle. She'd won the right for her people to tell their story.